So now we're going to have a look at the vintage tape module and also the vintage limiter. Now, something that struck me as I was kind of starting up this video is that I feel like the tonal balance control is, for me, going to become a replacement for a multimeter. So normally when I'm producing my own music, I'd have the multimeter open a lot of the time, just seeing what's going on with the frequencies, where things are hitting. But I think in some ways this is actually a more accurate depiction of what you're trying to do, because the multimeter just shows levels of frequency, whereas this is more like a kind of density meter of frequencies in different bands. In some ways it's kind of more useful than the multimeter, because the multimeter doesn't necessarily tell you the whole story, because it's literally just showing you levels, whereas this is showing you density, which is more important in many ways than the actual level. So we've got another track here. This is from the band Amongst Wolves, and it's called So Much More. So I actually just got a bit carried away with my vintage EQ from the last video, that I've just done a vintage EQ on this track, so we'll just do it without. Let's have a look at what Tonal Balance thinks of the whole thing. So it's added a little bit more body into the track, which I think works well. Okay, so moving on to the vintage tape module. So the vintage tape module is based on the Studer A810 2-track tape deck. But for many of you, you'll have no idea what one of those is. I remember using one of those at college when I studied sound engineering many moons ago. So people used to record on tape before we used computers and digital audio workstations. And tape does have some really, really nice characteristics that we can use in our audio today, even though we're not actually recording onto tape. The two of those are basically the influence it has on the frequency spectrum and also the saturation it provides. So as you drive the input into tape, it becomes more and more saturated, and it creates a kind of soft compression. This is great to use on things like basses, vocals as well. Anything you want to kind of really gently soften out the transients and create a more level signal. Tape compression is amazing for doing that. But also it can work on the master as well. You can even put tape modules on every single track. And if you're going for a really vintage sound for something, you can even put tape modules on the start of every single track, which will simulate recording onto a tape machine. Okay, so we've got different tape speeds. Now the tape speeds will change the kind of frequency response of the tape machine. So 7.5 inches per second is going to be duller comparative to 30 inches per second, and 15 is going to be somewhere in between. Let's have a little listen. Let's actually put some drive going on. Yeah, it's definitely a little bit brighter at 30 inches per second. Now the input drive, as we just discovered, is how much we're driving into the tape machine. And when we go really high, let me just actually gain match so we can bypass, we get a really, really kind of saturated, distorted sound. So the bias control actually, again, affects the frequency response of the tape machine. And if we increase the bias, it ends up kind of being more distorted and also a little bit warmer, so a little bit less high frequencies. As we lower the bias, it opens up a little bit and we have a few more kind of higher frequencies. The harmonics control will add in even harmonics. Tape machines normally create odd harmonics. Quite a subtle one, that one. And then we can emphasize the low frequencies or the high frequencies. Okay, so let's have a play while the track's playing with some of the parameters. It's pretty subtle, but it opens out slightly, I'd say, with the tape machine on. Okay, so let's have a look at the vintage limiter. Okay, so the vintage limiter is loosely modelled after a Fairchild 670, which is a classic mastering limiter, more of a broadcast limiter. And it's based on tube circuitry, so it has a nice warming effect and also a little bit of a boost in the high end. Now, this vintage limiter also includes an IRC1 limiter at the end to prevent clipping. So you could use this as your final limiter at the end of the track. Alternatively, you could also just apply a little bit of limiting here and then use the maximizer afterwards as well. Definitely something you could experiment with. So we've got different flavors: analog, tube, and modern. Analog has a fast attack and a variable release time, and it provides tight bass response and a thick limiting quality. Tube is more balanced and has a variable attack and release time, and modern is a more modern effect, a little bit more precise. Now the threshold we're used to seeing on other dynamics processors, and the ceiling means we can set the output level. Now we can also link these two together to give us input and output linking, which means you can actually really hear what's going on with the processing. And it also means if you don't want to use this as the final part of your chain, you can kind of match your input and output. Now the character will change an attack and release time simultaneously. Okay, let's have a little listen to how it sounds. So when it comes to these vintage components, you're not necessarily listening for the same things as you are with a clean digital processor. Well, you're definitely not. So as much as you're listening to what it's doing in terms of suppressing the level of the sound or the dynamics of the sound, also you're trying to hear what it's doing sonically. I feel like this is quite subtle, but I definitely feel in the tube mode it slightly opens out the frequencies.
Just take your chance, don't let this moment pass you by. You were made for so much more. What you waiting for? Just take your chance, don't let this moment.
Let's try analog.
Just take your chance, don't let this moment pass you by. You were made for so much more. What you waiting for? Just take your chance, don't let this moment pass you by. You were made for so much more. What you waiting for? Just take your chance, don't let this moment pass you by. You were made for so much more. What you
Okay, let's have a listen to the track and we'll take out and then bring in all three of these vintage processors.
looking for love, all in the wrong places. She sees her reflection in empty faces, chasing a dream, longing to find that spark, but all that they ever do is leave their mark. Don't let your one-track mind make you miss out this time. Just take your chance, don't let this moment pass you by. You were made for so much more. What you waiting for? And just keep dreaming and dreaming. You were made for so much more. What you waiting for? Just let your ceiling be your flight. You can break out every lie, 'cause you were made for more. He can restore all that has been and broken, all of the lies.
Definitely adding something, it definitely feels more balanced with those three processors in. Okay, so now we've looked at the vintage components we get with Ozone 8. The next video we're going to have a look at balancing the track using the dynamics module. Thanks for watching.